In November of 2012, America ran out of Twinkies. Panic ensued. People hoarded them. Boxes of the golden sponge cake sold for hundreds of dollars online. The apocalypse had seemingly arrived. But the real shock wasn't that the snack disappeared. The real shock was why it vanished. A legendary company, generating $2.5 billion in annual revenue, had completely collapsed. It was dead. It was liquidated. The ovens went cold. The delivery trucks were parked forever. Yet just 4 years later, this exact same brand was taken public. It was valued at $2.3 billion. And recently, it sold to a conglomerate for nearly $6 billion. This is impossible. Dead companies do not rise from the ashes to become multi-billion-dollar titans. They rot. But this one didn't. They executed a turnaround so mathematically improbable, it is studied in private equity boardrooms worldwide. And they did it through a controversial, hidden mechanism. One that completely destroyed the very foundation of how they had historically done business. I will reveal exactly how they pulled off this unprecedented resurrection later in this breakdown. First, we must examine the corpse. We are talking about Hostess Brands, the makers of Ho-Hos, Ding Dongs, Wonder Bread, and the immortal Twinkie. For nearly a century, Hostess was the undisputed king of the American lunchbox. They were ubiquitous. They were woven deeply into the cultural fabric of the nation. But under the surface, Hostess was a financial zombie. They were carrying over $1 billion in debt. They were drowning in unfunded pension liabilities. They were managing a logistical nightmare so complex it defied all modern business logic. So how did a bankrupt, liquidated bakery transform into one of the most profitable packaged food companies in modern history? How did a private equity firm buy a dead brand for pennies on the dollar and flip it into a $6 billion empire? That is the question we are answering today. To understand the magnitude of this triumph, you first have to understand the depth of the failure. You have to understand the slow, painful strangulation of a corporate giant. This is the dip in our journey. This is the anatomy of a catastrophic business model. For decades, Hostess operated on a system called direct store delivery, or DSD. In the mid-20th century, DSD was a competitive advantage. It meant that Hostess baked its products in massive regional bakeries and loaded them directly onto a fleet of their own delivery trucks. Hostess drivers would then drive directly to tens of thousands of grocery stores, convenience stores, and gas stations across the country. The driver would physically walk into the store, remove the old, stale product from the shelves, and meticulously restock the display with fresh cakes and bread. It was highly personalized. It guaranteed freshness. But there was a fatal flaw in this system. It was unbelievably, almost comically, expensive. By 2012, Hostess was maintaining an armada of over 5,000 individual delivery routes. They operated 36 separate industrial bakeries. They managed 565 distinct distribution centers. The overhead was staggering. Gas prices were fluctuating. Vehicle maintenance costs were skyrocketing. But the physical infrastructure was only a fraction of the actual problem. The real rot was structural. Hostess was bound by some of the most complex, restrictive, and archaic labor agreements in the history of American manufacturing. Over the decades, the company had negotiated an astonishing 372 different collective bargaining agreements. They had dozens of distinct pension plans to fund. The work rules within these contracts were incredibly rigid. Let me give you an example of how broken this was. Under the union rules at the time, the employee who loaded the bread onto the truck was legally prohibited from loading the cakes. The employee who drove the truck was not allowed to load the truck. The driver who delivered the bread could not deliver the Twinkies. They were literally sending 2 separate trucks, driven by 2 separate drivers, to the exact same grocery store. One to drop off Wonder Bread and one to drop off Twinkies. This is operational suicide. Furthermore, drivers were barred from physically shifting products around in the back of their trucks. If a crate of ding-dongs was blocking a crate of bread, the driver could not move it. They had to wait. This level of fragmentation created a bloated, paralyzed workforce. Hostess had over 19,000 employees, and a massive percentage of their revenue was being set on fire just to maintain this labyrinth of legacy contracts. The margins vanished. Hostess was slowly suffocating under the weight of its own history. They tried to fix it. In 2004, Hostess Brands, then known as Interstate Bakeries, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Chapter 11 is a reorganization. It is a desperate play for time. The company is allowed to keep operating while it tries to negotiate its debts, trim the fat, and figure out a path to profitability. They stayed in Chapter 11 for 5 agonizing years. When they finally emerged in 2009, it was supposed to be a new dawn. Private equity firms had pumped hundreds of millions of dollars into the company. They had a new name. They had a new board of directors. But they had not fixed the core problem. They had merely put a bandage on a gunshot wound. The crushing pension liabilities remained. The direct store delivery model remained. The separate trucks for bread and cake remained. By 2011, Hostess was bleeding cash again. They suspended their contributions to the union pension funds because they simply did not have the money. The unions were furious. Management demanded massive wage concessions. The workers refused. The tension reached a boiling point. In January of 2012, Hostess filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy again. But this time, there was no bailout waiting in the wings. This time, the debt load was fatal. Management proposed a drastic restructuring plan. They demanded an 8% wage cut across the board. They demanded dramatic reductions in benefits. They demanded the consolidation of those absurd delivery routes. The Teamsters, representing the drivers, eventually and reluctantly agreed. But the Bakers' Union, representing the people actually making the Twinkies, drew a hard line. They went on strike. On November 9, 2012, thousands of Hostess bakers walked off the job. They formed picket lines outside the factories. They believed the company was bluffing. They believed Hostess would eventually cave to their demands. They were wronged. Hostess was out of money. The strike completely paralyzed production. Without fresh product hitting the shelves, revenue dropped to zero overnight. The company issued a final ultimatum. Return to work by Thursday afternoon, or we shut the entire company down permanently. The deadline passed. The bakers stayed on the picket line. On Friday morning, Hostess management pulled the plug. They filed a motion in bankruptcy court to convert their Chapter 11 reorganization into a Chapter 7 liquidation. Chapter 7 is the end of the line. It means the company is dead. It means you sell off the ovens, the trucks, the brands, and the recipes to the highest bidder, and you go home. 18,500 people lost their jobs immediately. The iconic Twinkie was dead. This is the bottom of the J-curve. This is the moment of absolute, irrecoverable failure. Hostess was a victim of its own inability to adapt. They prioritized a legacy system over modern efficiency. They let organizational bloat destroy a billion-dollar brand. But where the public saw a tragedy, a few highly specialized investors saw the opportunity of a lifetime. Enter Apollo Global Management and C. Dean Metropoulos. Apollo is one of the most ruthless and successful private equity firms on the planet. They specialize in distressed assets. They buy the ugly, broken, dying companies that no one else wants. So, Dean Metropoulos is a billionaire investor known as the turnaround king of the food industry. He is the man who resurrected Pabst Blue Ribbon. He understands legacy brands better than anyone alive. Together, they looked at the smoking crater of Hostess. They didn't see the billions in debt. They didn't see the pension liabilities. The bankruptcy court had wiped all of that away. The slate was clean. What they saw was pure, unadulterated intellectual property. They saw universal brand awareness. They saw a product that 99% of Americans instantly recognized. You cannot buy that level of cultural penetration. You can only inherit it. In early 2013, Apollo and Metropoulos teamed up. They walked into the bankruptcy auction and bought the Hostess snack cake brands for $410 million. They did not buy the bread business. They did not buy Wonder Bread. They let a competitor buy that. They only wanted the high-margin, nostalgic sugar bombs. Twinkies, cupcakes, ho-hos, and donuts. But buying the brand was only the first step. The real genius was what they did next. They had to rebuild the company from absolute scratch. But they refused to rebuild the old model. They recognized that the direct store delivery system was a poison pill. If they hired back 5,000 drivers and bought 5,000 trucks, they would just go bankrupt a third time. They needed a radical, fundamental shift in logistics. They had to pivot to a warehouse distribution model. In a warehouse model, you do not deliver directly to individual convenience stores. Instead, you load massive pallets of product onto semi-trucks. You deliver those pallets to giant, centralized distribution centers owned by Walmart, Target, and Kroger. The retailers then handle the final mile of distribution. Walmart's trucks take the Twinkies from the Walmart warehouse to the local Walmart store. This shifts the massive burden of logistics off the manufacturer and onto the retailer. It is exponentially cheaper. It requires a tiny fraction of the workforce. But there was a massive structural problem blocking this strategy. Science. The DSD model worked because Hostess products had an incredibly short shelf life. A traditional Twinkie was only good for about 26 days. In the old system, a driver could take a fresh cake from the bakery, drive it to the gas station, and put it on the shelf on day 3. It would sell before it went stale. But a warehouse distribution model is inherently slow. If you ship a pallet to a Walmart distribution center, it might sit there for 2 weeks before it gets loaded onto a store-bound truck. By the time that Twinkie finally makes it to the actual grocery store shelf, 20 days might have passed. With a 26-day shelf life, the product would be stale almost immediately. The retailer would demand a refund. The model would collapse. To execute the financial turnaround, they had to alter the fundamental chemistry of the product. They had to play God with the Twinkie. This is the turning point of the struggle. This is the hidden secret of the entire operation. Apollo and Metropoulos invested heavily in food science. They completely overhauled the recipe. They didn't change the taste. They couldn't change the taste, or the public would riot. But they meticulously optimized the preservatives. They tweaked the acidity levels. They altered the packaging to create a better microenvironment inside the plastic wrapper. Through aggressive chemical engineering, they achieved the impossible. They extended the shelf life of a Twinkie from 26 days to an astonishing 65 days. This changes everything. 65 days is an eternity in the packaged food industry. It completely unlocked the warehouse distribution model. Suddenly, Hostess didn't need a massive fleet of delivery trucks. They didn't need 5,000 route drivers. They didn't need localized, regional bakeries scattered across the country to guarantee freshness. The operational bloat evaporated overnight. They reopened just 3 massive, highly automated bakeries. They invested heavily in robotics. Instead of 19,000 employees fighting over arcane loading rules, the new Hostess operated with barely over 1,000 non-unionized workers. They spent roughly $110 million upgrading these 3 facilities. They installed auto packers. They installed robotic arms that could flawlessly box thousands of Twinkies an hour. The new Hostess was a lean, hyper-efficient machine. They were producing exactly the same amount of product as the old company, but with a fraction of the overhead. The profit margins, which had historically hovered near zero, suddenly exploded. They were running margins north of 30%. This is practically unheard of in the commercial baking industry. By the summer of 2013, less than a year after the company died, the new Hostess was ready to launch. They orchestrated a massive marketing campaign. They called it the sweetest comeback in the history of ever. They plastered "Prepare Your Cake Face" billboards across the country. They leveraged the immense, built-up nostalgia and the lingering panic of the Twinkie disappearance. They didn't have to spend a fortune on explaining what the product was. They just had to remind people that it was back. And the public responded with absolute ferocity. When the trucks rolled out to deliver the first batch of new 65-day Twinkies, retailers completely sold out in hours. Demand was astronomical. Hostess was instantly profitable. But Apollo and Metropoulos were not bakers. They were financial engineers. They did not buy Hostess to run a bakery for the rest of their lives. They bought it to sell it. They needed an exit strategy. And they found one in a relatively new financial instrument that was about to take Wall Street by storm. The SPAC, a special purpose acquisition company, or SPAC, is essentially a blank check shell company. It is a company that has no actual business operations. It goes public on the stock market, raises a massive pool of cash from investors, and then goes hunting for a real, private company to buy. When the SPAC buys the private company automatically inherits the SPAC's place on the stock market. It is a backdoor method of going public, completely bypassing the grueling, expensive, and heavily regulated traditional IPO process. In 2016, a massive SPAC called Gores Holdings approached Apollo and Metropoulos. Gores Holdings wanted Hostess. They saw the explosive profit margins. They saw the massive free cash flow generated by the new warehouse distribution model. They struck a deal. The SPAC merged with Hostess. The new entity was listed on the NASDAQ under the ticker symbol TWNK. The valuation was staggering. $2.3 billion. Apollo and Metropoulos had invested just $410 million 3 years earlier. Through ruthless optimization, chemistry, and logistical restructuring, they had multiplied their investment by more than 5 times. It was one of the greatest private equity home runs of the decade. And that is the core insight. That is the climax of this strategy breakdown. The secret to saving Hostess was not marketing. It was not a clever ad campaign. It was destroying the legacy infrastructure. The original Hostess failed because it believed it was in the delivery business. They believed that owning 5,000 trucks and managing 19,000 employees was an asset. It wasn't. It was a fatal liability. Apollo and Metropoulos realized that Hostess was actually in the intellectual property business. The value was in the brand, not the trucks. By radically altering the chemistry of the product, they divorced the brand from the physical infrastructure required to deliver it. They turned a highly perishable bakery item into a stable consumer packaged good. They solved a logistical nightmare with food science. This brings us to a critical inflection point. The collapse of the original Hostess was fundamentally a failure of organizational alignment. It was a failure of human capital management. When a company has 372 different labor contracts, when management cannot communicate with the workforce, and when operational rules are so disjointed that different people have to load different cakes onto different trucks, the organization will inevitably die. You cannot scale a disjointed workforce. You cannot pivot a legacy company if your human resources are trapped in silos. When your internal structures are fragmented, your external execution fails. That is why modern organizations require centralized, intelligent systems to manage their people and their operations. This is exactly why high-growth companies rely on platforms like PulseMina HCM. PulseMina HCM is not just an HR tool. It is an operational command center designed for the modern enterprise. When you're managing complex workforces, navigating different jurisdictional rules, and trying to align thousands of employees toward a single strategic goal, you need a system that acts as the central nervous system of your company. PulseMina HCM unifies talent management, streamlines complex organizational structures, and ensures that your workforce data is actionable in real time. If legacy Hostess had possessed the workforce visibility and agile operational alignment that a platform like PulseMina HCM provides, they might have identified the internal rot decades before it pushed them into bankruptcy court. Because when your human capital is flawlessly aligned, your business becomes incredibly resilient to market shocks. And resilience is exactly what the new Hostess proved. They continued to grow. They expanded their product lines. They acquired other snack brands. They optimized their warehouse distribution model until it was practically flawless. The market rewarded them. The stock price climbed steadily over the next 7 years. And then the ultimate validation arrived. In late 2023, the J.M. Smucker Company, the giant conglomerate known for Smucker's jelly, Jif peanut butter, and Folgers coffee, decided they wanted to dominate the sweet baked goods category. They looked at the landscape. They saw Hostess generating incredibly stable, high-margin revenue. They saw a supply chain that was lean and automated. They made an offer. Smucker's acquired Hostess Brands for an astonishing $5.6 billion. Let that sink in. A brand that was entirely dead, liquidated, and sold for scrap a decade earlier was now worth nearly $6 billion. This is the ultimate business principle you must take away from this story. Never mistake your infrastructure for your value proposition. Hostess assumed their value was in their massive network of bakeries and delivery drivers. But the consumer didn't care about the delivery driver. The consumer only cared about the Twinkie. When your delivery mechanism becomes a liability, you must be willing to burn it to the ground. You must be willing to ruthlessly audit your own operations. If your legacy systems are preventing you from adapting to the modern market, those systems are killing you. Sometimes saving a legendary brand requires completely destroying the company that built it. If you learned something new, hit the like button and subscribe for more strategy breakdowns. And let us know in the comments, what company's strategy should we unlock next?